The fog clung to the morning air like a memory that wouldn't let go. In the dim light, Max, a German shepherd, stared at the wall, motionless, silent. His eyes were empty, his body frail, as if he had already given up on the world around him. The room was cold, the floor covered in dust, and the walls peeled away like the remnants of a forgotten past. There was nothing here but the sound of his shallow breathing and the occasional creak of the old house, as if the structure itself had given up too. The door creaked open, but Max didn't move. He had no reason to anymore. He had been abandoned, left behind, in a place where no one cared, where no one came to help. For days, maybe weeks, he had waited in this dark, silent room, staring at that same wall, as if hoping that something, someone, might change his fate. And then, the sound of boots on the floor broke the stillness. Michael Grant, a U.S. Marine, stepped into the room. His heart heavy from years of war and loss. He glanced at the dog lying in the corner, barely able to lift his head. His thoughts were clouded with the bitterness of his own struggles. His body ached from the injuries he had carried back from the battlefield, but his soul, that was where the real weight was. He knew what it felt like to be abandoned, to feel as if everything had been taken from you. The thought of this dog, left in a corner to die, stirred something deep within him. Michael slowly approached the German shepherd, unsure of what to expect. The dog's eyes met his, slowly, almost as if the dog were afraid of the connection. Max's fur was matted, his body emaciated. But there was something in his eyes that Michael couldn't ignore, a spark of hope, even in the face of all the pain. "Hey there, buddy," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse from the years of silence. Max didn't move. He simply stared. Michael knelt down, his knees creaking, and extended a hand toward the dog. He had been in countless battles, but this moment felt different. This moment was personal. It was not about fighting for survival anymore. It was about healing, about saving a life that had been broken. And then, as if Max had finally decided that he was not alone anymore, the dog slowly lifted his head, just slightly. Michael's heart skipped a beat. There was still life in him, still a chance for something better. With a deep breath, Michael gently placed his hand on Max's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's skin beneath the fur. The dog trembled slightly, but didn't pull away. There was a trust forming, a bond between two lost souls, both scarred, both abandoned, both in need of saving. As Michael helped the dog to his feet, a small movement, barely noticeable, shifted in Max's body. It was like the first breath of life after a long, painful struggle. They were not so different, Michael thought. They had both fought battles, some of them lost, but others still worth fighting. With every step Max took, Michael could feel the weight lifting off him, as if the dog was reminding him that there was still hope in the world, still something worth fighting for. And though the path ahead would be long and difficult, Michael knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. It wasn't just about saving the dog, it was about saving himself. Michael stood in the dimly lit room, his heart pounding as he gently stroked Max's fur. The dog, though still weak and frail, seemed to recognize that something had changed. The silence that had filled the room for so long was now broken by the soft sound of Max's breathing. Michael knew that this was the first step of many. It wasn't going to be easy, but he had seen enough battles to know that the hardest ones were always the most worthwhile. The room, once filled with despair, now held a flicker of hope. Michael gently lifted Max into his arms, carefully cradling the German shepherd as he began to move towards the door. Max's head rested against his chest, his body still trembling, but now there was a sense of connection between them, a bond that neither of them had expected. Michael stepped out into the cold morning air, the weight of the world still heavy on his shoulders, but with a newfound purpose. As he placed Max carefully into the back seat of his truck, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace, a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. The road ahead was long, and there were many challenges waiting for them. Both, but at least now, they had each other. Driving through the quiet streets, Michael glanced at Max in the rearview mirror. The dog's amber eyes were closed now, and for the first time, Michael felt a sense of calm that he hadn't experienced in years. He had seen too much destruction, too much pain, but as Max rested, Michael realized that this moment, this simple, quiet moment, was enough to remind him that there was still good in the world. He didn't know where the road would take them, but he knew they would face it together. It wasn't about saving Max anymore. It was about finding redemption for both of them. As Michael drove toward the small cabin he had called home for years, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an ordinary rescue. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder. A reminder that even in the darkest times, there could be light. A reminder that even after losing everything, there was always something worth fighting for. When they arrived at the cabin, Michael gently helped Max out of the truck. The dog's legs wobbled slightly, but he stood firm, his gaze steady and focused. Michael opened the door and led Max inside, his hands trembling as he turned on the lights. The small cabin was quiet, except for the sound of the wind howling outside. Michael set Max down on a soft blanket by the fireplace and sat beside him. The warmth of the fire flickered in the dim room, casting long shadows across the walls. As he watched the flames dance, Michael thought about the journey ahead. The road would be hard, and there would be setbacks, but he wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a reason to keep going. Max looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude and trust. It was as if the dog knew that, no matter what came next, they would face it together. Michael placed his hand on Max's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur. They didn't need to say anything. They both understood. Together, they would find their way back to the life they had lost, one step at a time. The next few days passed in a quiet routine. Michael kept a watchful eye on Max, the dog now more alert, though still frail from his time spent in that abandoned house. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling in the hearth, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the air each morning. But there was a difference in the way Michael moved now. He had a sense of purpose, a quiet determination that had been missing before. Max, for his part, seemed to understand this unspoken change. He watched Michael with steady eyes, his head tilted slightly, as if pondering the bond that had begun to form between them. Every evening, Michael would sit by the fire, a book in hand, while Max lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, and the two of them would sit in comfortable silence. Michael's injuries from the war still ached, the scars from both the battlefield and the emotional toll of years spent in conflict remained. But there was something about Max's presence that helped ease the weight of it all. One evening, as the firelight flickered and the night grew cold, Max suddenly stirred. Michael looked up from his book, noticing the dog's ears perk up. Max slowly got to his feet, wobbling slightly, before he padded toward the door. Michael watched him curiously. He hadn't seen Max move like this before, with purpose. "Where are you going, buddy?" Michael asked softly, standing to follow the dog. Max reached the door and looked back at Michael, as if waiting for him to follow. Michael hesitated for a moment before walking over, opening the door, and stepping outside with Max. The air was crisp, and the sky above them was dotted with stars, the night peaceful and still. But Max moved quickly, his steps sure despite his weakened body, and Michael followed behind, his curiosity growing. They walked down the path that led through the woods, the trees standing tall and silent around them. Michael's boots crunched on the frost-covered ground, and the quiet of the forest surrounded them. It felt like a journey, though he wasn't sure where it would lead. After what felt like an hour of walking, Max stopped, his ears perked, his body stiffening. He sniffed the air, and then, without warning, he barked, a sharp, urgent bark that echoed through the trees. Michael froze, his heart racing, unsure of what was happening. But as he looked around, he saw nothing. "What is it, Max?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Max barked again, louder this time, and then began to move forward, his eyes locked on something in the distance. Michael followed, his breath coming faster, and he began to run after the dog, the sound of his boots thudding against the frozen earth. They reached a clearing, and Michael's eyes widened in surprise. There, in the middle of the clearing, stood a small, abandoned cabin, its windows boarded up and its structure weathered by years of neglect. It was the last place Michael expected to find, especially in the middle of nowhere. But something about it felt familiar. Max moved closer, his body tense, his nose to the ground. Michael followed the dog, his mind racing. "What are you trying to show me, Max?" he muttered under his breath. As they approached the cabin, Max stopped at the door, looking up at Michael with a soft whimper. Michael reached out to touch the door, his hand trembling slightly as he felt the rough wood beneath his fingers. The cabin had been abandoned for years, and yet there was something in the air, a feeling that he couldn't shake. It felt like a sign, a calling, but from where? Michael paused for a moment, taking in the scene. Max stood by his side, watching him, his amber eyes filled with something Michael couldn't explain. It was as though the dog knew something Michael didn't, knew that this place held a deeper meaning. Michael's instincts kicked in. He had always trusted his gut, and right now, it was telling him that something important was waiting for him inside. He opened the door. The inside of the cabin was dark, the air thick with dust, but there was something else, something that stirred the moment Michael stepped inside. It was as if the cabin had been waiting for him, waiting for this moment to come. Max entered with him, his body low to the ground as he moved carefully around the room, his eyes scanning every corner. Michael took a deep breath and began to explore the cabin, his steps slow and deliberate. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew that he needed to be here, that whatever had brought him and Max to this place was something they both needed to understand. As he moved through the cabin, his hand brushed against an old, dusty table in the corner, and there, hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers, he found it, a small, weathered box. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't know why, but he felt an overwhelming need to open it. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of old photographs, letters, and a few small trinkets. As Michael sorted through the items, he came across a photograph of a young man in military uniform, standing next to a German shepherd. His chest tightened. The man in the photograph looked strikingly similar to him, and the dog. Well, the dog looked exactly like Max. Michael felt a lump form in his throat as the pieces began to fall into place. The connection between him and Max was not just a chance encounter. It was fate. This was no ordinary rescue. This was their destiny. Michael sat down on the worn chair, the photograph still in his hand. His heart raced as he stared at the image of the young soldier and the German shepherd, their bond undeniable. The resemblance between the soldier and himself was uncanny, and Max, who lay by his side, seemed to sense the significance of the moment. It was as if the dog was waiting for Michael to piece together the story that had been buried in this forgotten cabin. The letters and photographs had clearly been untouched for years, their edges yellowed and brittle, but as Michael sifted through them, he could feel the weight of their history. The soldier in the photograph had written several letters to a loved one, his words filled with hope and longing. One letter, dated several years ago, caught Michael's attention. As he read the words aloud, he could almost hear the soldier's voice, steady but filled with emotion. I promised him that I would come back for him, no matter what. Max has been by my side through it all. He saved my life, and now I must save his. Michael paused, his breath catching in his throat. He had been saved by this very dog, Max, the same dog from the photograph, the same dog who had been with the soldier through every battle. The connection was undeniable. Max was not just a stray he had rescued. He was a link to a past that Michael had never known, but was now inexplicably tied to. Michael's hands trembled as he held the letter, his mind racing. How was it possible that Max had found him? How was it that this dog, who had been through so much, had ended up in his care? It was a mystery, but Michael felt deep down that there was a reason, a purpose behind it all. As he looked down at Max, who was now sitting up, his amber eyes locked onto Michael's, the Marine couldn't help but feel that this was not just about saving a dog. It was about healing, about finding a way to mend the broken pieces of his own soul. Max had been through hell, just like him, and yet, here they were, together. Michael gently placed the letter back on the table and stood up, his legs stiff but strong. He walked to the window, looking out over the quiet, snowy landscape. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist. The world was still, but Michael could feel the pulse of something greater, something that was guiding him. Max had been the soldier's companion, his loyal partner, and now he was Michael's. The past, the memories, the pain, they were all coming together in a way Michael couldn't explain. But one thing was clear, this was where he was meant to be. The fire in the hearth crackled as Michael turned back to the room, his eyes falling on Max once more. The dog's gaze followed him, steady and unwavering. Michael walked over to him and crouched down, his hands gently resting on the dog's shoulders. You and me, Max, he whispered, his voice low. We're in this together. We'll figure it out, one step at a time. Max wagged his tail, just once, as if to agree. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Michael stood up, a sense of resolve settling over him. There was no turning back now. They had both been given a second chance, and together, they would face whatever came next. Michael had always believed in the power of loyalty, in the bond that could form between a soldier and his dog. But now, standing in this quiet cabin with Max by his side, he understood it in a way he never had before. The bond they shared wasn't just about survival. It was about trust, about healing, and about the strength to carry on even when everything seemed lost. As the night wore on and the fire burned low, Michael felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. Max lay at his feet, content and calm. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, there was warmth, there was hope, and most importantly, there was a bond that nothing could break. Days passed, and the quiet routine of the cabin began to feel like a kind of peace Michael had never known. He spent his mornings working on small repairs around the place, fixing leaky pipes, mending the roof, while Max followed him every step of the way, always close by. It was as though the dog had become his shadow, and Michael had grown accustomed to the comforting sound of Max's paws patting behind him. The cabin, once a place of solitude and pain, now felt like home, a place where healing could happen, not just for Max, but for himself as well. Michael still woke up each morning with the weight of the past pressing on him, but the heaviness wasn't as overwhelming as it once had been. Every day, he felt a little more grounded, a little more whole. Max, too, seemed to grow stronger. His movements were less stiff, and the energy that had been missing in the early days of their time together began to return. The dog would run around the yard in the mornings, his tail wagging as he chased after sticks Michael would throw. Michael found himself laughing more these days, something he hadn't done in years. The sound of laughter felt foreign at first, but with Max by his side, it began to feel like something natural, something that belonged in his life. As the weeks passed, the bond between them deepened. Michael found that the more time he spent with Max, the more his own fears and doubts seemed to fade. There was something about the dog's quiet presence that made him believe, for the first time in a long time, that maybe everything wasn't as lost as he once thought. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the forest, Michael sat on the porch, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Max sat beside him, his head resting on Michael's knee, the two of them watching the world go by in companionable silence. It was in these moments that Michael felt the most connected to Max, as if they shared an unspoken understanding. The dog had been through his own battles, his own losses, and yet here they were, together, finding a way to heal. Michael's thoughts wandered back to the letter he had found in the cabin, the one written by the soldier who had once been Max's companion. The words had haunted him, a reminder of promises made and bonds forged in the most difficult of circumstances. I promised him I would come back, the letter had said. I will always come back for him. Michael couldn't help but feel the weight of those words, knowing that the soldier's promise had somehow brought him and Max together. It was as if fate had a hand in their meeting, pulling them from different worlds and placing them on the same path. The thought gave Michael a strange sense of peace. Perhaps there was still a greater purpose in his life, something beyond the pain and loss. As the night grew colder, Michael stood up and stretched, his back stiff from sitting for too long. Max followed him, his ears perked, ready for whatever came next. "Let's take a walk," Michael said, his voice low but steady. They walked through the snow-covered woods, the crunch of their footsteps the only sound in the stillness of the night. The moon shone brightly above, casting a soft glow over the trees and the path ahead. Michael felt a sense of calm that he hadn't known in years. There was no longer any rushing, no urgency to get somewhere or do something. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to just be, to breathe in the cool, crisp air and appreciate the quiet beauty of the world around him. Max walked beside him, his movements steady and sure, and Michael couldn't help but feel grateful for this companion who had brought him back from the edge. As they reached the top of a small hill, Michael stopped and looked out over the valley below. The town was visible in the distance, small and quiet, and beyond that, the vast expanse of the mountains stretched out as far as the eye could see. "This is it, buddy," Michael said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. "This is where we're meant to be." Max turned his head and looked up at him, his eyes full of understanding. There was no more need for words. Michael knew, in that moment, that he had found something worth fighting for, something worth living for. And as the snow continued to fall softly around them, Michael knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Max would face them together. The days grew colder, the wind picking up as winter fully embraced the mountainside. Michael spent his mornings in the small workshop behind the cabin, repairing tools and making small improvements to the place. Max, ever loyal, remained by his side, always watching with those steady amber eyes. It was as if the dog understood that these moments of quiet were what they both needed to heal. Every now and then, Michael would catch himself staring at Max, wondering how this dog had found him, how their paths had crossed in such a strange and meaningful way. It was as if fate had woven their stories together, not by chance, but by something much deeper. One afternoon, after finishing the repairs to the barn door, Michael sat on the porch, his back against the cabin's wooden frame, while Max lay at his feet, his head resting on Michael's boots. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the snow-covered landscape. Michael's mind wandered back to the soldier in the photograph, the one who had written the letter and the bond he shared with Max. He could feel the weight of that connection, something beyond words, something that transcended time and distance. Max had been the soldier's companion, his protector, and now, in some way, he was Michael's too. Michael rubbed the back of his neck, trying to shake off the weight of the past that still lingered, like an invisible shadow. He had left the military life behind, but it wasn't as simple as just walking away. There were pieces of him that still carried the memories of those years, the pain, the loss, the men he had left behind. It wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. But with Max by his side, he felt as if there was a chance to rebuild, to find peace in the quiet moments. The sound of the wind howling through the trees brought him back to the present, and he took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs. Max stirred, at his feet, lifting his head and perking up his ears. Michael followed the dog's gaze toward the woods. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it, but then he saw it too, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching them. Michael stood slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Max was already on his feet, growling softly, his body tense. The figure didn't move, just stood there, as if waiting. Michael's mind raced, his instincts kicking in. It had been a long time since he had felt this uneasy, this alert. Was it someone from his past, someone who knew where he had gone? Or was it someone else entirely? Max took a step forward, his growl deepening. Michael hesitated for a moment, then called out, "Who's there?" His voice was steady, but there was a tightness to it that he couldn't shake. The figure didn't answer, but slowly, they took a step forward, revealing themselves from the shadows of the trees. As they came into the light, Michael's eyes widened in surprise. It was a man, dressed in a heavy coat, his face partially obscured by a scarf. But it wasn't the man's appearance that startled Michael. It was the dog that followed him. A large German shepherd, much like Max, trotted out from behind the man and stopped at his side, looking up at Michael with the same steady gaze. The two dogs stared at each other for a moment, their eyes locked, before Max stepped forward, as if drawn to the other dog. Michael's heart raced as the man approached, but he didn't back away. Instead, he held his ground, his eyes never leaving the stranger. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man said, his voice rough but not threatening. "I've been looking for you." Michael's brow furrowed, confusion and suspicion mixing in his chest. "Looking for me? What?" The man paused, his dog sitting obediently by his side. "Because I know about Max," he said quietly, "and I know about the promise." Michael's pulse quickened. The promise. The words from the letter, the soldier's promise to always come back for Max. How could this man know about that? The stranger seemed to sense Michael's confusion. "I was the one who made the promise," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm the soldier in the photograph. And Max has been waiting for me." Michael's world tilted. This was the man from the letter, the one who had once been Max's companion. And yet here he was, standing in front of him, as if stepping out of the past itself. Max, sensing the tension, stepped closer to Michael, his body relaxed but alert. The two dogs exchanged another look, and it was as if the connection between them, between all of them, had been reignited. Michael could hardly believe it, but in that moment, something clicked into place. The past, the present, and the future, everything came together. Max had not only been his rescue, but now, he understood, Max had been the key to something even greater. The man before him was not just a stranger. He was part of a story that had been written long ago, and now it was time for it to be completed. The wind had picked up by the time the man and his dog made their way closer to Michael. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if the weight of time itself had caught up with him. Michael stood frozen, Max by his side, both of them trying to comprehend the surreal nature of what was unfolding. The man looked older than the soldier in the photograph, his face marked by years of hardship, but his eyes still held that same quiet resolve. "I don't know where to start," the man said, his voice carrying the heaviness of lost years. "Max and we've been through a lot, but we've never forgotten each other, and I made a promise I intend to keep." Michael's heart raced. His mind was still processing the revelation. This man, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, was the one who had been Max's original companion. This was the soldier from the photograph, the one who had promised never to leave his side. But what did that mean for him? For Max? "You've been looking for him?" Michael asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man nodded, his gaze never wavering from Michael's. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I left him behind after my deployment, after everything that happened. I thought I could go back for him, but by the time I got the chance, he was gone. I searched for years, hoping to find him, but I never did." His voice trailed off, the regret evident in his words. Michael didn't know what to say. He had been through his own share of battles, his own struggles with loss, but this was something entirely different. The soldier had not only lost his dog, but had carried the guilt of that loss for years. Max's tail wagged softly, as if sensing the weight of the moment. The two dogs looked at each other once more, their eyes filled with unspoken understanding. It was a silent reunion, one that didn't require words. The bond they shared, despite the years apart, was still strong. Michael felt a deep sense of respect for the man standing in front of him. He understood now that this was not just about a dog being rescued. It was about something much deeper, about promises made, about loyalty, and about the power of never giving up, even when the world had other plans. "I don't know what this means for us, for Max and me," Michael said, his voice shaky but steady. "But he's been with me all this time. He saved me, too." The soldier smiled faintly, the weight of his years lightening just a little. "I can see that. I'm glad he found you." The two men stood there in the cold, the air thick with everything that had gone unspoken. Michael's heart felt heavy, yet somehow lighter at the same time. He had never imagined that this was how it would end, that the promise made years ago would finally come full circle. He thought of the life he had with Max now, of the quiet mornings and the long walks through the woods. He had come to realize that Max was not just a dog. He was family. And now, the soldier, this man, had come to reclaim a piece of that family. But Michael wasn't sure if that meant Max would leave him. He couldn't bear the thought of losing the dog who had saved him, who had brought him back from the edge. The soldier must have sensed Michael's hesitation. "You've given him something I couldn't," he said softly. "You've given him a home. And that's something I can never take from you." Michael's chest tightened. He glanced down at Max, who was looking up at him, his eyes steady and full of trust. The bond between them, the bond that had been forged over weeks of silence and healing, was undeniable. Michael knew in that moment that no one could take that away. "Max is yours," Michael said, his voice quiet but firm. "But he's mine too." The soldier nodded slowly, understanding the depth of Michael's words. "I know," he said, his voice filled with a quiet gratitude. "I know." The wind blew through the trees, the cold biting at their skin, but in that moment, Michael felt a warmth that he hadn't felt in years. The past, with all its pain and confusion, seemed to fade away, leaving behind only the present, only the bond between him, the soldier, and Max. It was a bond that would never be broken. And as they stood there, together, Michael knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would be written with trust, loyalty, and the love of a dog who had always known where he belonged. The morning after the soldier's arrival, Michael woke to the soft sound of Max's breathing beside him. The day was cold, but the cabin felt warmer now, the tension that had hung in the air for so long starting to dissipate. Michael had spent the night thinking about the soldier's words, about the promise that had been made so many years ago, and about what it meant for him and Max. The soldier had said he was not there to take Max away, but there was still something inside Michael, a quiet fear that he couldn't shake. Max had become his companion, his friend, his family. He had saved Michael in ways that were hard to explain. Michael couldn't imagine life without him. As the sun rose over the mountains, Michael made a decision. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Max go. Not now. Not after everything they had been through together. Michael walked to the kitchen, where the soldier was already sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in his hands. The two men exchanged a look, both understanding the unspoken thoughts that were running through their minds. "I know what you're thinking," the soldier said quietly, his voice filled with a gentle resolve. "But I've already had my time with him. What you and Max have, it's different. I can see that." Michael nodded, his throat tight. He could see the truth in the soldier's eyes, a truth that resonated deeply with him. Max had found a new purpose in life. With Michael, he had a home now, a place where he was loved and cared for. "He's yours," Michael said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "But he's mine too." The soldier smiled faintly, a look of relief crossing his face. "I understand," he said softly. "You've both found something here, something that I couldn't give him. And for that, I'm grateful." There was a long pause, the weight of everything that had been said hanging in the air. Michael and the soldier both knew that their paths had crossed for a reason, but now it was time to move forward. "I think you've done more for him than I ever could," the soldier continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given him a life, a second chance. I can't take that from you." Michael felt a weight lift from his chest. The fear, the doubt, that had clung to him all night, was gone. He wasn't losing Max. They were simply moving forward together as a family. Max, sensing the shift in the air, walked over to Michael, his tail wagging softly. Michael bent down and scratched behind the dog's ears, a smile tugging at his lips. Max was home, and that was all that mattered. The soldier stood up from the table, his eyes lingering on Max and Michael for a moment before he turned to the door. "I'll be on my way now," he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of sadness. "Thank you, Michael, for everything." Michael nodded, unable to find the words. There was nothing left to say, only the quiet understanding that they were parting ways. The soldier walked out the door, his dog following him, and Michael watched them leave, the final chapter of their shared story coming to an end. But as he stood in the doorway, watching the two of them disappear into the distance, he knew that this was not the end of his journey with Max. This was just the beginning. As the door closed behind him, Michael turned to Max, who was sitting by his side, looking up at him with those familiar amber eyes. "You and me, buddy," Michael said, his voice full of certainty. "We've got a long road ahead." And with that, they both turned, walking back into the warmth of the cabin, ready to face whatever the future held. Together, the next few weeks passed with a gentle rhythm, a routine that allowed Michael to find peace in the simple things. The cold winter days stretched on, but inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire and the steady presence of Max brought a sense of calm that Michael hadn't known in years. He spent his days working around the property, taking care of small repairs and chores, and Max was always there, never far from his side. It was as if the dog had found his place in the world again, his spirit healing just as Michael's was. As the days grew longer, the snow began to melt, revealing patches of earth beneath the winter blanket. The air turned warmer, and the birds began to return, filling the morning with their songs. Michael could feel the change in the air, a shift from the heavy weight of winter to the lightness of spring. It was a time of renewal, a time for growth. And in the quiet of the cabin, Michael found himself feeling more alive than he had in years. The burden of the past, the memories of war, of loss, no longer haunted him with the same intensity. Max had been the key to that. The dog had brought him back from the brink, showing him that there was still beauty in the world, still moments of peace worth fighting for. One afternoon, as Michael sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, Max lay beside him, his head resting on Michael's boots. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft, golden light across the landscape. It was a moment of stillness, one that Michael had come to cherish. As he sat there, watching the world go by, he realized how far they had come. Max had been through so much pain, so much loss, but here he was, by Michael's side, steady and loyal. The dog had come from a place of darkness, but now he was a symbol of hope, a reminder that no matter how broken something may seem, it could always be rebuilt. "You're a good dog, Max," Michael said softly, his voice filled with quiet affection. Max looked up at him, his amber eyes reflecting the warmth of the moment, and Michael felt a surge of gratitude for the dog who had saved him in ways he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just about the rescue, about bringing Max out of that abandoned house. It was about the bond they had formed, the trust that had grown between them. They had both been broken, but together, they had found a way to heal. As the days continued to pass, Michael and Max began to explore the land around the cabin. They walked through the woods, their steps crunching in the newly thawed earth. The once frozen ground was now soft and giving, and the trees seemed to stretch their branches toward the sky as if greeting the change in the seasons. Michael felt a sense of freedom he hadn't known in years, a freedom that came with the simplicity of the world around him. It wasn't much, just a cabin in the woods, a dog at his side, but it was enough. They didn't need anything else. One afternoon, as they walked deeper into the woods than they had ever gone before, Michael stopped at a clearing. He looked around at the familiar landscape, the trees, the open sky, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him. It was as if everything had led to this moment. Everything he had gone through, every hardship, every battle, had brought him here, to this place, to this moment of calm. Max sat beside him, looking up at Michael with those steady eyes, and for a moment, there was no past, no future, only the present. The bond between them was all that mattered. "We made it, Max," Michael said softly, his voice full of emotion. Max wagged his tail slightly, as if in agreement. Michael's heart swelled with a feeling he had long forgotten. It was love. It was trust. It was peace. And as they stood there in the clearing, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the forest, Michael knew that this was where he was meant to be. With Max together, they had found a home, not just in the cabin, but in each other. And that, he realized, was all he would ever need. As the months went by, Michael and Max settled into a rhythm, their lives intertwining in a way that felt right. The spring turned to summer, and the land around the cabin bloomed with life. Flowers sprouted in the garden Michael had planted, and the trees, once barren and skeletal, now stood tall and full of green. The days grew warmer, and the nights were cool and peaceful, with only the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Michael found himself waking each morning with a sense of contentment that had once felt impossible. The weight of his past, though still there, no longer controlled him. With Max by his side, he had learned to live in the moment, to appreciate the quiet beauty of the world around him. He had never imagined that something as simple as a dog could change his life so completely, but Max had done just that. There was something about the dog's presence that helped Michael find peace within himself. Each day, Max grew stronger, his coat growing thicker and healthier, his movements more energetic and full of life. Michael watched the transformation with a sense of awe. He had saved Max, but in the process, Max had saved him too. One evening, after a long day of work around the cabin, Michael sat on the porch, his legs stretched out before him as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. Max sat beside him, his head resting on Michael's knee, both of them watching the horizon in silence. It was moments like this that made everything feel worth it. As the sun set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Michael took a deep breath, savoring the peacefulness of the moment. "We've come a long way, huh, Max?" he murmured, his voice low but full of emotion. Max raised his head, his amber eyes meeting Michael's, and Michael could see the understanding in the dog's gaze. The bond between them was unspoken but undeniable. Max had become his constant companion, his friend, and his family. Michael had always been a man who valued strength, but it was in moments like this that he realized the true strength lay in the quiet moments of connection, in the relationships that anchored him to the world. As the evening settled into night, Michael stood up and stretched. He looked down at Max, who had already risen to his feet, his tail wagging in the soft evening light. "Let's go for a walk," Michael said, smiling. They had taken countless walks together, but each one felt like a new adventure, a new chapter in their journey. The world was still and quiet, the stars beginning to twinkle in the clear night sky as they walked down the familiar path that led through the woods. The trees, now full of leaves, whispered softly in the breeze. Michael felt a deep sense of peace settle over him as he walked, his steps light, his heart full. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of uncertainty, but with Max by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. The dog was more than just a companion. He was a reminder of what it meant to trust, to heal, and to move forward. As they reached a clearing, Michael stopped and looked up at the night sky. The stars seemed to stretch endlessly above them, and for a moment, he felt small, yet at the same time, incredibly connected to everything around him. Max sat down beside him, his eyes following Michael's gaze to the heavens. "We're not alone, Max," Michael whispered. "We never were." Max gave a soft whine, as if agreeing, and Michael chuckled softly. The moment felt timeless, as if they were part of something much bigger, something eternal. And in that moment, Michael knew that no matter where life took them, he and Max would face it together. The world was vast, and the road ahead was uncertain, but they had each other. And that was enough. The seasons shifted again, and with it, the cabin and its inhabitants continued to grow. The once quiet, isolated place now felt like a true home. Michael and Max had settled into a routine that felt natural, almost as if it had always been meant to be this way. The days were filled with work, mending fences, tending to the small garden that had flourished with the warmth of summer, and the nights were spent by the fire, with Max lying at Michael's feet, his loyal presence a constant source of comfort. As the year progressed, Michael began to realize just how much had changed since Max entered his life. He had come to the cabin a broken man, weighed down by years of pain and loss, but Max had shown him a different way of living. The dog had been through so much, abandoned, lost, and alone, but now, Max was thriving, and so was Michael. The weight of the past had not disappeared, but it was no longer the thing that defined him. One morning, after a long stretch of rain, Michael decided to take Max on a walk to the nearby lake. The air was fresh, and the forest smelled of earth and pine. As they walked along the familiar trail, Michael felt a sense of peace settle over him. The world around him was still, the only sounds coming from the birds overhead and the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Max walked ahead, his nose in the air, his tail wagging gently. Michael smiled to himself, watching the dog move with the ease of one who had found his place in the world. When they reached the lake, Michael sat down on a large rock, watching the water ripple gently in the breeze. Max, ever curious, wandered to the water's edge, dipping his paws into the cool water. The sun was low in the sky, casting a soft, golden light across the scene. It was moments like these that Michael cherished, moments when everything seemed perfect, when the weight of the world felt a little lighter. As Max splashed around in the lake, Michael thought about the journey that had brought them here. He had never imagined that a dog could change his life in such a profound way. Max had become more than just a companion. He had become a symbol of hope, of resilience, of the power of never giving up. Michael had always believed in the strength of the human spirit, but now, he understood that strength could come from the most unexpected places. As the sun began to set, Michael stood up and called to Max. The dog trotted back to him, shaking off the water, his eyes bright and full of life. They started back along the trail, the night beginning to settle in around them. Michael felt a deep sense of gratitude for this life, for the moments of peace that had slowly woven themselves into his days. He had a long way to go, and there would be challenges ahead, but with Max by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. As they made their way back to the cabin, Michael glanced down at Max, who was walking beside him, his head held high. "You and me, Max," Michael said softly, more to himself than to the dog. "We've made it this far, and we'll keep going." Max gave a small bark as, if in agreement, and Michael smiled. Together, they had found something worth living for. Together, they had found a way to heal. As the months continued to pass, Michael's life became more and more entwined with Max's. The routine they had created together was simple, but it was exactly what both of them needed. The quiet mornings, the afternoons spent walking through the woods, and the nights by the fire. It all gave Michael a sense of peace he had never known. He was learning how to live again, how to find joy in the small things, and Max was right there with him, every step of the way. One afternoon, after a morning of work around the cabin, Michael decided to take a break and head into town. He hadn't been into town in a while, but he knew he needed some supplies, and the idea of seeing other people, even for a short time, didn't seem so bad. Max, as always, was at his side, ready for whatever came next. The drive to town was peaceful, the road winding through the valley, past the trees that were now fully in bloom, their leaves vibrant with the color of spring. Michael couldn't help but feel grateful for the beauty of the landscape around him. The world was changing, just as he was. When they arrived in town, Michael parked the truck and stepped out, with Max by his side. The town was small, but it had everything he needed: grocery stores, a small hardware shop, and a cafe where locals gathered to chat and relax. Michael made his way through the town, stopping to pick up supplies, nodding to familiar faces, and exchanging a few brief words with the people he saw. As he was leaving the cafe, he overheard a conversation between a couple of the town's residents. They were talking about a storm that was expected to hit the area in a few days. The forecast said it would be a big one: heavy rain, strong winds, and possibly snow. Michael felt a wave of unease. It wasn't just the weather. He hadn't been through a storm like that in a while, and the thought of being stuck in the cabin alone with Max was both comforting and intimidating. But he knew he was prepared. He had the supplies, the knowledge, and most importantly, he had Max. The bond between them had grown so strong that, even in the face of uncertainty, Michael felt that together, they could handle whatever came their way. As they made their way back to the truck, Max trotted ahead, his ears perked, as if sensing the change in the air. Michael followed, his thoughts racing. The storm was coming, and they would have to face it together. But for the first time in a long time, Michael didn't feel afraid. He felt ready. The truck ride back to the cabin was quiet, but the storm clouds were already gathering in the sky, dark and heavy, a reminder of what was to come. Michael glanced at Max, who was resting his head on the seat, his eyes calm, as if he already knew what was ahead. When they arrived back at the cabin, Michael started a fire in the hearth and prepared for the storm. The wind began to pick up, the trees swaying in the distance. The first raindrops began to fall, gently at first, then harder as the storm approached. Michael and Max sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames a stark contrast to the growing chill outside. As the storm raged on, Michael felt a sense of calm settle over him. He wasn't alone. He had Max, and that was all he needed. The storm, like everything else in life, would pass. And together, they would weather it. As the wind howled outside and the rain beat against the windows, Michael sat back in his chair, his hand resting on Max's fur, feeling a sense of peace he had never known before. He had found his home, and it wasn't just the cabin, it was the bond he shared with Max. The storm would come, and it would go, but they would remain. And in that certainty, Michael found his strength. As the storm raged outside, the crackling fire inside the cabin provided a comforting warmth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain beat heavily against the windows, but inside, Michael and Max were at peace. The storm had come in full force, but it didn't seem to matter. Michael had grown accustomed to the rhythms of nature, the way it could change in an instant. The storm felt like another challenge, another test that life had thrown at them. But this time, it didn't feel like something to fear. With Max by his side, Michael felt an unspoken confidence, a quiet assurance that they could handle anything that came their way. Max lay by his feet, his breathing steady and calm, undisturbed by the chaos outside. Michael reached down and scratched the dog behind the ears, a soft smile tugging at his lips. Max lifted his head and looked at him, his amber eyes full of trust, full of understanding. It was as if the dog knew that, together, they had already faced so much, and whatever came next would be no different. The fire crackled, and Michael stared into the flames, his thoughts drifting. He thought about everything that had led him here, the pain, the loss, the journey that had brought him to this small cabin in the woods. It hadn't been an easy path, but it had been worth it. He had found a new beginning, a fresh start. And he had found it in the most unexpected of places. He had found it in Max. The bond between them had grown so strong, so unbreakable. It wasn't just about companionship, it was about survival, trust, and healing. Max had saved him in ways that Michael could never truly express, and in return, Michael had given Max a place to call home, a life that was filled with love and care. The storm outside rumbled on, but Michael wasn't afraid. He had everything he needed right here, in this moment. The storm would pass, as all things did, and when it was over, they would still be here, together. Max lifted his head again and stood, walking over to the window, and peering out. Michael followed the dog's gaze, watching as the rain poured down. The world outside transformed into a blur of gray and white. Max stood by the window for a moment, then turned and walked back to Michael, sitting down beside him once more. It was as if the dog was reassuring him, telling him that they were in this together. They didn't need to speak, it was understood. The bond between them spoke louder than words ever could. Michael reached down and placed his hand on Max's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur beneath his palm. He had come to realize that this life, this quiet existence, was more than he had ever hoped for. It wasn't perfect, and there would always be challenges ahead, but with Max by his side, Michael knew he could face whatever came next. As the fire flickered low, Michael leaned back in his chair, content and at peace. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the cabin was a sanctuary. Max lay at his feet, his head resting on the ground, content and calm. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had brought him here, the struggles, the pain, and the healing. He had found a home, and more importantly, he had found family. Together, they had faced the darkness and found the light. And no matter what the future held, Michael knew that he and Max would face it together, side by side.